Yay! Today we're going to talk about the diplomatic relationship between the United States and Britain and the Soviet Union during the Second World War. And these we've already talked about them being allies, obviously, in 1941, the formation of the Grand Alliance, because Nazi Germany invades the Soviet Union in June and Japan attacks the United States in December. So we now have this unplanned alliance between these three nations. But we want to remember that even though this alliance is going to be far superior than that of the Axis powers, we talked about Germany and Italy and Japan, kind of all having their own goals in the war and operating separately throughout the war. Whereas these allies are going to have a united front against Nazi Germany and then Japan. That doesn't mean they always agree on everything. So we are going to talk about the meetings that they have, and there's going to be 9 of them. Whew. We're going to talk about the meetings that they have. We're going to talk about the agreements that they make, but we're also going to make mention of the disagreements, because we want to make sure we recognize that these parties are not always seeing eye to eye on everything. Now, I said there's 9 of them, and I don't know if I would ever imagine all of you to memorize and remember all 9 of these meetings come May. So there's going to be a handful of them that are like super duper important to remember. And you're going to put a star by those in your notes to make sure of those ones that are on your standards, there are some that transcend this story and are definitely things that you're going to want to make sure you recognize and you remember, not just for the World War II story, but for when we talk about the Cold War going further. So, and a couple of them we've already talked about. So we don't need to spend too much time rehashing the story, for example, of the Washington Conference. And here's Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt meeting in Washington, D.C. immediately after the United States' entry into the war. So December of 1941, this is after Pearl Harbor. We are now a part of the war. Not the first time these two guys met, right? When did they meet it before? Not in Quebec, but off the coast of Canada, off the coast of Newfoundland, where what was signed? The Atlantic Charter that laid out the goals for a war that maybe one day the United States would enter. And now we have the United States actually in the war. So the Washington Conference is all about cooperation between the United States and Britain. It's agreed at the Washington Conference that there would be a joint military command, that American and British troops would operate jointly with each other. They would be together in this fight. As opposed to what we see maybe in by the Axis powers, Japan doing its own thing in East Asia and Germany doing its own thing in Europe. The Allies would also, as we've already mentioned, adopt a Europe first strategy. So Nazi Germany would be targeted first, and then Japan. Why? Why a Europe first strategy, do we think? And this is tough for the United States. We'll talk about that in a moment. Why a Europe first strategy? Yes. Germany is an immediate threat, especially to... Germany's immediate threat, especially to whom of those two parties? To Britain. It's right across the channel, right? Why is this problematic for the United States? Yeah, we desire revenge, and quick revenge. We weren't attacked by Germany. Germany declared war on us, but we weren't attacked by Germany. If anybody sees a rogue water bottle hiding, I'm hunting for it right now if you see me. Ah, there it is. Thank you. I'm going to need that today. That's not so subtle foreshadowing to I'm talking a lot today. All right, so I need my water. So a Europe first strategy is adopted. There will also be a declaration of United Nations. Now, I pause when I use this phrase because that was the phrase. It was a declaration of United Nations, that these nations are standing together. But this is not the formulation of the eventual United Nations that we will talk about within today's lecture. And this is an agreement, this Declaration of United Nations, this is an agreement between these two parties, and they hoped that other allied nations would declare the same, that they will fight until the end, that they will stay until the fight is over. Because they're both concerned about a country doing what? Maybe okay, I like that. Pulling a Russia in 1918, when Russia backed out of World War I, signing the Treaty of, anybody remember?
Brest-Litovsk.
Look at you guys go, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Very good. So they don't want any separate peace. No nation, or at least not the United States and Britain here. No separate peace. The Soviet Union is not here. Couple reasons. They are not at war with Japan. And December of 1941, what's going on in the Soviet Union? You've got the biggest army in human history marching deeper and deeper into Soviet territory. Stalin's got bigger fish to fry than getting on a plane and flying across the world to meet with Churchill and Roosevelt. Now, this is an initial meeting. They come to some agreements, but not everything is agreed to. Roosevelt sees some problems with his ally in Britain. Remember, one of the goals of this Atlantic Charter was that countries should be able to determine, or peoples should be able to determine for themselves how they want to be ruled. Yet Britain, our ally in this war, has the biggest empire in the world. Hundreds of millions of Indians have been spending the last couple decades clamoring for independence from British rule. And so this is problematic, and this is going to have to be dealt with at some point, Roosevelt knows. And next, there's issues over where should we go first in this fight. Roosevelt thinks opening up a true Western Front in France is the best course of action. Churchill, not ready for that yet. Churchill wants to avoid that. Churchill, of course, is an advocate for not having the fight in northern France, which would be right across the channel from England. Churchill wants to go to North Africa first. And that is ultimately where the Allies will first set up their first military operation, their joint operation, called Operation Torch in North Africa. We've already discussed it. Land in North Africa, squeeze Axis forces between Egypt and Morocco, and ultimately take North Africa. So you can get into what Winston Churchill called the soft underbelly of Europe. And that's where they'll go first. Yes, ma'am?
Wasn't this in the Atlantic Charter also to start off in North Africa?
No, because in the Atlantic Charter, that's before the United States is in the war. The Atlantic Charter is a statement of war goals, what the war is all about. Most importantly, that it will not be a war to take over territory, that it will be a war to defeat aggressive nations. Everybody good? Sweet. 1 down, 8 to go. Yeah. Okay, good. We move on to Casablanca. January of 1943, we turn a couple pages in the war. We now have had a successful invasion of North Africa. The Italians and the Germans in North Africa are now being squeezed. And we meet in Casablanca, which is a city in Morocco, in northwest Africa. There's a meeting in Casablanca in January of 1943, where they will continue to discuss future strategy. What's going to be the next step? Roosevelt, again, and one brief note about Roosevelt, just hear this, don't write. Roosevelt is quite a polarizing figure in American politics, and especially today. If you are someone who fashions yourself as a strong liberal Democrat, Roosevelt is like in your pantheon of great American presidents, right? For growing the size of the American government in order to aid the country in escaping the Great Depression. You love Roosevelt. If you fashion yourself as more of a conservative Republican type, Roosevelt is a disaster. And the expansion of the federal government of Roosevelt during the Great Depression not only didn't solve the Great Depression, but it actually prolonged the Great Depression. And politicians and political thinkers and economists will still debate this. Where there is far less debate is President Roosevelt and his diplomacy during the Second World War. Roosevelt is in a really tough position. And he's in this position largely because he is not as immediately threatened by Nazi Germany as his two allies are. Stalin is actively fighting the Nazis in the Soviet Union. And Britain obviously dealt with the Battle of Britain, and they've got Nazi Europe right across the English Channel. Roosevelt's in a little bit of a different position here. So when we see Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin seen together, and we can actually look at a future conference when they first get together, there we go. We're going to look at this in a moment. When they first get together, Roosevelt will be seated between these two guys, and that's how the arrangement is. I don't think I've ever seen a picture where we don't have Roosevelt between Stalin and Churchill. This doesn't mean that Stalin and Churchill will be at each other's throats if Roosevelt weren't between them. But it does give the symbolism that this guy proves to be a mediator between these two gentlemen. Stalin, more than anything else, needs a true Western Front opened. It's the only thing that Stalin thinks will relieve the pressure that he is fighting in the East. And Stalin has it in his head that the Allies are purposely delaying, especially Winston Churchill, purposely delaying opening that Eastern Front, with the idea that as long as we delayed opening an Eastern Front, then communists and Nazis would be killed. And Churchill would like that. So Roosevelt's job here is, yes, deal with Churchill, negotiate with Churchill, work out war plans with Churchill, but Roosevelt's got to keep Stalin in the back of his mind. Because we can't have a Stalin that is too angry or pushed too far or feeling abandoned from his allies. Because we've got a historical precedent. Maybe Stalin would work out his own agreement with the Nazis and leave the war. And that would be a disaster for everybody else involved. So while Churchill really wants to focus the attack in North Africa and then into Italy, Roosevelt needs to give Stalin, even though he's not even at this meeting, he needs to give Stalin some assurance that a Western Front, a true Western Front, would come. At Casablanca, despite the fact that our next step agreed is going to be into Sicily, our next hop from North Africa will be into Sicily, at Casablanca, Roosevelt gets Churchill to agree to open up a true Western Front, and that would happen sometime in 1944, in the following year. So, we don't have any details, but we're going to start working towards what will become Operation Overlord, and it's going to come in the next year. So Roosevelt can tell Stalin, we're coming. It's happening. We've got to plan this. It's going to take time. But we're not forgetting about you. We're not abandoning you. Because Joseph Stalin feels quite abandoned at this point. The United States will also continue to send aid into the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program. So Roosevelt is trying to make it clear to Stalin that we're not forgetting him. Also at Casablanca, the British and the Americans work to arrange joint bombing operations over Germany. The most important thing to come out of Casablanca, though, is the call for unconditional surrender. And I know we've already mentioned this, so I don't have to go into any depth. But the call for unconditional surrender. We will only accept an absolute defeat of the Axis powers. No conditional surrender. No, yes, we'll surrender, but we're going to keep the Sudetenland or Poland, or the Japanese are going to keep Manchuria. Surrender without conditions. That is the only thing that we'll accept. Some historians will argue that the call for unconditional surrender keeps Italy, Germany, and then Japan in the war for even longer than they otherwise would have been. Had they been able to negotiate their way out of it, maybe it would have ended faster. No way to tell that, though. The end of the conference, Stalin is furious that there is no agreement to open up a Western Front immediately. Stalin is irritated with this. Hearing that it's coming a year from now on some date is not enough for him. He's not a happy camper. But he's not pushed so far that he's going to stop fighting the Nazis. Next meeting, Washington, May of 1943. Again, we have Winston Churchill and Roosevelt. There's some, yes ma'am?
Was the Casablanca one, was that between U.S.
And Britain, yep. Soviet Union wasn't there because they couldn't get there. Nor are they here. At the Second Washington Conference, we begin to have some discussions about what's going to happen to Poland after the war. Now, this is going to come up in later conferences in more detail. But there's questions about the Polish nation. Because Poland is, of course, the reason that the war started in the first place in Europe, right? Britain and France declare war on Germany because Germany invades a sovereign Poland. This is going to be problematic, though, because we're quite sure that after the war, the Soviet Union is probably going to want some of Poland, maybe all of Poland. And that could be an issue, because if you fight a war to protect Polish sovereignty, but at the end of the war just give Poland to someone else, what was the whole war about? Also at this Washington Conference in May of 1943, there is an agreement made to invade Italy. We are now making our way from Sicily into Italy. And once Italy is defeated, our focus will be on opening that Western Front in France. A date will be given for the operation in France, the Allied invasion of France, and that date will be May 1st, 1944. So at Casablanca we say it's going to happen in 44, now we give an actual date. Roosevelt's got to make Stalin know that we're doing it, Stalin, we're totally planning this thing, it's coming, trust us. May 1st, 1944. Now you guys of course already know, when do we do it? June 6, 1944. So we miss our planned date. But we're telling Stalin this because we need him to know that we're working on it, Joseph Stalin. Next meeting. Quebec, 1943. August of 1943. Quebec. Here we have Winston Churchill again, Franklin Roosevelt again, and now Mackenzie King, the Canadian Prime Minister. It's not a crucial name for you guys to know, but he's in the picture, so we'll mention him. By August of 1943, the Italian fight is going slower than we had planned, which is delaying the planning of the Second Front in France. Did I say Italy? Yeah, we're in Italy now. So it's going slower in Italy than we had planned on, which is delaying our planning for Operation Overlord. And then Winston Churchill has got another plan that needs to be discussed. Here's a map of Europe. Italy, this is where the Allied powers are fighting the Axis. Directly across the Adriatic Sea is Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia is a country that we're going to mention both in the Second World War and in the early Cold War. The Nazis have invaded Yugoslavia. The Nazis are occupying Yugoslavia. But Yugoslavia hasn't capitulated, hasn't given up like some other European countries did in the Second World War. They have a massive resistance movement in Yugoslavia that is actively fighting the Nazis. Collectively, we refer to this resistance movement as the partisans in Yugoslavia. The partisans. One name that you guys will be familiar with as we push into the Cold War, a leader of Yugoslavian partisans, is a guy named Josip Broz Tito. Tito will eventually be the leader of a communist Yugoslavia. He's a communist leader fighting against the Nazis in World War II in Yugoslavia. Well, remember, Churchill likes this whole soft underbelly of Europe thing. So he wants to start sending operations into Yugoslavia. Again, avoiding this invasion, right? He wants to send troops into Yugoslavia. Roosevelt says, no, we've got to go to the Second Front. We've got to go to France next. We've already talked about it. Joseph Stalin is pulling his hair out. And so it is agreed to at Quebec that military aid will be sent into the partisans. Military aid will be sent into the partisans fighting the Nazis. But we're not sending troops in there. So American or British troops were not setting foot in Yugoslavia. The focus is going to be on the French operation, Operation Overlord. It now has a name. It is finally talked about at Casablanca that Operation Overlord will be a or pardon me, at Quebec, that Operation Overlord will be primarily American men, primarily American material, so it will have an American leader. This is decided at Quebec. It'll be helpful for us when we recognize that this is at the Quebec conference, that much of the planning for Operation Overlord is drawn up, because Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion, is not just the Americans and not just the British, but also thousands of Canadians will also be storming the beaches at Normandy, or at least one beach in Normandy for Canadians. Everybody good? Excellent. Next conference, first meeting of the Big Three. Tehran. Today it's the capital of Iran. Then it would have been called Persia. November of 1943. The first meeting of the Big Three. Now things are going a little bit better for Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, and he's able to head south to Tehran. The Soviet Union is directly north of Iran. So it's easier for Stalin to get to this. So they meet, and it's the first meeting of the Big Three here. Roosevelt, he has to work really hard at this conference to gain the trust of Stalin, because Stalin doesn't have a whole lot of trust for the Allies. Remember, he thought that the Allies are stretching out this invasion of Europe because it would kill more communists. Roosevelt is thinking about what we could call the long game. Roosevelt is recognizing that this war is going to be over one day, and we're going to have to deal with the Soviet Union that helped win this war. So we would rather have the Soviet Union on good terms with us than otherwise. So at Tehran, we discussed future Allied attacks, including Operation Overlord. An official date is now confirmed to Joseph Stalin that Operation Overlord will come on May 1st, 1944. This had already been discussed, but now it's set in stone and given to Stalin. And now we begin to talk about what the world is going to, or what Europe at least is going to look like after World War II. Germany. The Big Three decide that after World War II, Germany will be broken up in some form. We'll get more detail at later conferences as to how that's going to look. Stalin proposes that there be a permanent occupation of German lands. That's a little dicey. No one can agree to that. But we start to see what Stalin is thinking going forward. Now, I'm sure we're going to hear this tomorrow from Dr. Reddish, but why do you think a guy like Stalin, with what the Soviet Union has been through, would want a permanent occupation of Germany? It would create a buffer, it would be protection, because under what threat has the Soviet Union been? Been invaded by Germany. Not only in 1941, but also in the First World War, right? When German armies were marching in Russia. Now I know. Who started that one? Who invaded whom first in World War I? You guys recall this? Did Russia attack Germany first, or did Germany attack Russia? They declared war at about the same time, but Russia actually invaded East Prussia first. But that's a side story. We'll forget about that going forward. We're also going to talk at Tehran about Poland. Stalin wants to see Poland as what we can call a buffer state. We already used that word. Stalin wants to see Poland as a buffer state. Protection between the Soviet Union and Germany. And Stalin is hoping that we can do this amazing trick with Poland, where we take Poland, pick it up, and move it to the west, and put it back down. It's really heavy, you need a lot of stilts and heavy equipment, but we're going to pick Poland up, move it to the west, and put it back down. Effectively giving eastern Poland to the Soviet Union, and giving eastern Germany to Poland. That's what Stalin's going to want. Again, this is problematic, because why did we go to war in the first place? To protect Poland. And what did Britain and America agree to at the Atlantic Charter? This is not a war about gaining land. And so this is an issue if now one of your allies, and a vital ally, can the Americans and the British win this war without the Soviet Union? Absolutely not. Now a vital ally we know is going to be making territorial demands. The world isn't always black and white, is it? You have these shades of gray we have to deal with. It makes everything difficult. The outcomes of Tehran, we do have that date for Overlord of May 1st. It's agreed that the partisans in Yugoslavia will get even more aid, including air raids. We will start providing air support to partisans in Yugoslavia. The Soviet Union agrees to join the war against Japan as soon as the war against Germany is over. Remember, to this point, the Soviet Union's not in a war with Japan. In fact, they have a Russo-Japanese non-aggression pact. But the Soviet Union will break that as soon as the war against Germany is over. Do I need to say that these are all like secret meetings? Like these meetings, like the details of the agreements here are not being published in the papers. So Japan is not going to pick up their Sunday newspaper and see that the Soviet Union plans to invade. We all recognize that, right? Okay, good. We start to have the outlines at Tehran, the outlines of a new international organization that we will call the United Nations. The beginning planning of the existence of the United Nations will start. This is where the seed of the future UN will be planted. A UN that has as its goal much of the same things that the League of Nations had as their goal, but the United Nations will have more teeth, and it will have the United States in it. It's agreed to at Tehran that we will give Poland that shift so the Soviet Union can gain some territory. We compromise our principles, right? We compromise. Why do we have to compromise our principles? Gotta win the war. Gotta win the war in the now. And then Stalin's got a little bit of an issue. He says, whoa, whoa, whoa. You keep telling me that we're going to open up a Western Front, and you tell me that it's going to be May 1st, 1944. But we haven't even picked, or you haven't even decided who's going to lead that invasion. You don't have a commander of those forces yet. So at Tehran, Franklin Roosevelt will choose Dwight Eisenhower to be the leader of the Allied forces in France. So this is where Dwight Eisenhower becomes the supreme Allied commander in Europe. And it's Dwight Eisenhower that will organize and plan for Operation Overlord. Everybody good? Now pause there.